Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, frankly, fascinating paradox unfolding right now at the very edge of Europe. It's this wild situation where geography, changing demographics, and totally opposite political visions are just colliding in real time. Okay, let's jump right into this stark contrast, because it's been making international headlines everywhere. Think about it. Right now, across the European Union, countries like Italy and France are pulling up the drawbridge. They're tightening borders and ramping up deportations. But Spain? Spain is doing the exact opposite. They literally just opened up a pathway to legal residency and work permits for a staggering 1 million undocumented migrants who are already living in the country. We're talking about a massive regularization scheme on a continent that is, by all other accounts, locking its doors. To figure out why Spain is acting as such an outlier, this explainer is going to cover 5 key areas. 1, the Spanish migration anomaly. 2, a demographic time bomb. 3, the economic engine. 4, the political pushback. And 5, the border reality. Section 1, the Spanish migration anomaly. The sheer speed and scale of this policy shift is just unprecedented. Back in January 2026, the Spanish government announced a decree to regularize undocumented migrants. They were initially expecting, maybe 500,000 applicants, but by June, that number had completely doubled. 1 million migrants applied for legal status to integrate into the formal tax-paying labor force. And the ripple effect? It was instantaneous. By July 31st, Italy took the extraordinary step of actually suspending its Schengen open border arrangements with Spain on sea and air routes, specifically citing national security. Section 2, a demographic time bomb. To truly grasp the why behind this open-door policy, we have to look at historical population data, which reveals a pretty stark reality. Over the last few decades, while the native Spanish demographic basically flatlined, the foreign-born population absolutely exploded. Without that intense influx of people, Spain's population literally would not have grown at all. And the crucial point boils down to this single number right here, 1.4. That is Spain's average birth rate per family. Now, to sustain a national workforce, naturally, a country needs a replacement rate of 2.1. So Spain is miles below that threshold, and honestly, they have been for decades. This isn't just some abstract social shift. It's a massive structural vacuum in the labor market. Millions of future workers simply do not exist. The demographic clock is ticking. Section 3, the economic engine. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez made the economic math incredibly clear to the public. He stated flat out that without regularizing immigrants and bringing them into the formal economy, the nation's GDP would shrink by a massive 19% by the year 2050. So he's framing immigration not just as a humanitarian issue, but literally as the fundamental survival mechanism for the Spanish welfare state. And look, a 19% GDP drop isn't just an arbitrary line on a graph. It translates to everyday, on-the-ground life. According to government projections, that drop means 90,000 local bars and hospitality venues shutting down because they can't find staff. It means 50,000 empty classrooms. And perhaps most critically, the total collapse of 220,000 agricultural farms that rely heavily on vital, low-wage migrant labor just to harvest the crops. We can actually see this playing out right now. Official data from the Banco de España reveals exactly how employment and productivity are currently being kept afloat. As the domestic population ages out of the workforce, the labor supply is being sustained almost entirely by the influx of immigrant workers, along with older nationals who are delaying their retirement. So, economically speaking, it's a purely pragmatic lifeline. Section 4, the political pushback. But of course, this economic lifeline is causing serious domestic friction. Looking impartially at the domestic political scene, there is intense opposition from the center-right People's Party, the PP, and the far-right Vox Party. They recently teamed up to form regional government pacts centered around a concept they call national priority. This policy explicitly aims to favor native-born Spaniards over foreign-born residents when it comes to things like subsidized housing, social rentals, and public benefits. Critics of the regularization present a very, very different socioeconomic view from the Prime Minister. They raise genuine concerns that relying so heavily on low-wage migrant labor places a heavy strain on public health and just worsens the country's existing housing crisis. Economically, they argue it stagnates wage growth at the bottom and basically traps Spain in a low-productivity economy, heavily relying on cheap labor for tourism and farming instead of innovating into high-tech industries. On top of that, they argue this 1 million-person regularization creates a massive effecto llamada, a pull factor that could encourage human trafficking networks to send even more undocumented migrants to Spain's borders. And these intense domestic pressures aren't just political rhetoric. They've actually led to concrete legal shifts. For instance, in May 2025, a reform of the aliens regulation went into effect that actively restricted residency paths. It specifically stopped rejected asylum seekers from easily getting temporary residence permits based on ties to the country. So they tightened the bureaucratic rules right as the wider regularization debate was really starting to heat up. We're even seeing this tension spill over into the judiciary. Recent high court orders document the ongoing, incredibly complex legal battles happening right now. The courts are constantly having to adjudicate employment rights for migrants whose asylum claims were denied, and they're having to arbitrate massive disputes between regional and central governments over who is legally and financially responsible for accommodating unaccompanied minors. Section 5. The Border Reality. Ultimately, all this political and legal debate collides with physical geography. When we look at the timeline on the ground at Spain's actual borders, which serves as Europe's southern frontier, we see an escalating humanitarian and security crisis. In 2025, the Canary Islands and the enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla were so overwhelmed they had to declare an extraordinary migratory contingency. By March 2026, the Supreme Court legally forced the central government to take in unaccompanied minors from those regions. And all of this culminated just this month, in July 2026, with a massive, chaotic, and tragically deadly border rush in the North African enclave of Ceuta. The sheer scale of the physical challenge at the border is just staggering. Following that July surge in Ceuta, Spanish authorities actually had to push back and return over 48,000 migrants to Morocco. Local processing centers and emergency response teams are completely maxed out. They are caught right between a domestic policy of economic integration and a physical reality of overwhelming numbers. And this brings an incredible nuance to the whole story. Despite his fierce pro-migration stance when it comes to the economy, the chaotic reality on the ground forced Prime Minister Sanchez to take a really hard line on this specific incident. He publicly called the mass border rush in Ceuta an attack and a violation of Spain's territorial integrity. It just goes to show that even a government desperate for migrant labor still has to maintain physical control of its borders. Unsurprisingly, this local Spanish crisis instantly became a European one. Because regularized migrants gained the freedom to move throughout the entire Schengen zone, Spain's neighbors panicked. Italy reinstated border controls on Spanish routes. French President Emmanuel Macron actually deployed mobile forces and drones to the Spanish border. And the EU Commission had to step in, demanding immediate and orderly border management. They are deeply worried that Spain's economic solution is creating a massive security loophole for the rest of the continent. Which brings us to the core paradox of our explainer today. Spain is staring down a massive demographic collapse, and they've chosen a radical economic solution that is absolutely sending shockwaves through the EU. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. As the demographic time bomb continues to tick down across the entire continent, will the rest of Europe eventually be forced to adopt Spain's regularization model just to survive? Or will intense political and physical border pressures break the Spanish system first? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on Europe's southern border.